The dust of Redemption Creek, Montana, tasted like sorrow on that blistering August afternoon in 1888. Inside the town's only church, light struggled through the grimy panes of glass, illuminating a bride whose tears traced clean paths through the fine layer of grime on her cheeks. Every soul in that stifling chapel could hear her ragged breaths, each one a testament to a heart breaking in real time. She stood beside a man, as stoic as the mountains themselves, a cowboy whose hands were calloused and whose eyes held a quiet storm. As the preacher's words faded, she'd choked on the words "I do," and the cowboy leaned in his voice, a low rumble that only she could hear, making a vow far more binding than the one the preacher asked for. The heat in the clapboard church was a physical weight pressing down on the shoulders of the assembled townsfolk of Redemption Creek. It smelled of dry wood, nervous sweat, and the wilting wild roses clutched in Isabella Rossi's trembling hands. Her veil was a cruel mockery, a thin gossamer barrier that did nothing to hide the silent, steady stream of tears carving paths down her face. Before her stood Pastor Michael, his face a mask of practiced neutrality, his words about union and devotion turning to ash in the air. Beside her stood the groom Caleb Hayes. He was not a cruel man, she knew that much. In their few stilted interactions, he had been quiet, respectful, his gaze never lingering where it shouldn't. He was a man of the land, his face weathered by sun, and wind his hands shaped by leather reins and hard labor. He was also a stranger, a tool in a transaction that was costing Isabella her soul. Her gaze drifted past him to the front pew. There sat Silas Kane, the architect of her misery. Kane owned most of Redemption Creek, the general store, the saloon, the largest cattle ranch, and most importantly, the water rights. He was a man whose smile never reached his cold, calculating eyes. Beside him, looking small and defeated, were her parents, Carlo and Maria Rossi. Her father's face was ashen, his pride stripped away, leaving behind the hollow shell of a man who had made a deal with the devil to save his failing vineyard, a deal that had required only one thing in payment: his daughter. "Do you, Isabella Rossi, take this man, Caleb Hayes, to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Pastor Michael's voice boomed, startling a fly buzzing near the window. Isabella's throat closed. The name that screamed in her mind was not Caleb. It was Liam O'Connell, with his laughing green eyes and a promise of a life far from this dust-choked valley. Liam, who had been accused of rustling Kane's cattle 2 months ago, and had been run out of the territory by Kane's hired guns, if he was even still alive. The accusation was a lie, a convenient fiction crafted by Silas Kane to remove the only obstacle to his true prize. Kane didn't want Isabella for himself. His vanity was of a different sort. He wanted control. The Rossi vineyard was the last significant parcel of land with its own spring that he didn't own. Her father, a proud man from the old country, had refused to sell. So Kane had found another way. He had fabricated a massive debt called in-markers, and then, with a magnanimous gesture, offered a solution. His most reliable rancher, Caleb Hayes, was in want of a wife. A union would tie the Rossi land to Kane's interests through loyalty. The debt would be forgiven. The family would be safe. A sob escaped her lips, a raw, wounded sound that echoed in the silent church. Her mother flinched, a fresh wave of tears spilling down her own cheeks. "Miss Rossi." The pastor prompted, his patience fraying. Caleb shifted beside her. He hadn't touched her, hadn't tried to comfort her. He simply stood like a granite monolith, his presence both a comfort and a torment. He was the cage she was walking into, but he was also the reason the wolves were no longer at her family's door. She squeezed her eyes shut, picturing Liam's face, then her father's broken expression. The choice was no choice at all. I do. She whispered the words, tasting like poison. When it was Caleb's turn, his voice was clear and steady, a low baritone that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. I do. There was no joy in it, only a quiet finality. As the pastor pronounced them, man and wife, Isabella felt a cold dread wash over her. This was it. The end of her life, the beginning of her existence. The finality was suffocating. She couldn't breathe. She didn't want to breathe. Her shoulders shook with the force of her grief, her carefully constructed composure shattering into a million pieces. The whispers started in the back of the church. Shameful, a woman clucked. Crying like that. Just as Caleb was meant to lift her veil, he leaned in close, his rough wool jacket brushing her arm. The scent of leather sage and clean earth filled her senses, a stark contrast to the cloying perfume of the church. His lips were close to her ear, and his voice was a current of unexpected warmth in her cold sea of despair. It wasn't a lover's whisper, but something else. A promise. I know this ain't what you wanted. He murmured, his breath a ghost against her skin. I know, but I swear on my own soul, Isabella, I'll make you smile someday. The words were so unexpected, so deeply sincere, that her crying hitched for a single stunned second. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a demand. It was a vow. A vow made just for her in the shadow of the one they'd been forced to make before God and Silas Cain. Through the blur of her tears, she looked up and met his eyes for the first time that day. They were a clear, steady blue like a winter sky, and in their depths she saw not the arrogance of a new husband, but a profound and unsettling sorrow that seemed to mirror her own. The ride from the church to Caleb Hayes's homestead was a silent 4-mile purgatory. Caleb drove the buckboard, his hands sure on the reins, his posture straight and unyielding. Isabella sat beside him, a chasm of propriety and raw emotion between them. The wedding guests had dispersed after a tense and joyless gathering at her parents' home, where Silas Cain had made a show of toasting the happy couple, his eyes glittering with triumph. Now the world had shrunk to the rhythmic clopping of the horses' hooves, the creak of the wagon wheels, and the vast, indifferent expanse of the Montana sky. The Rossi vineyard, with its struggling vines and familiar comforts, disappeared behind them, replaced by rolling plains of buffalo grass and distant purple-hued mountains. This was Caleb's world, stark and beautiful and terrifyingly empty. Isabella clutched the small satchel on her lap, which contained all the belongings she had been allowed to bring to her new life. His homestead was nestled in a small, sheltered valley, cut by a creek that ran clear and cold. It wasn't the sprawling empire of Silas Cain. It was a modest, well-kept ranch house, built of sturdy timber, with a wide porch and a stone chimney. A barn stood nearby, freshly painted, and the fences were in good repair. It was the home of a man who took pride in his work, who built things to last. It should have been comforting. To Isabella it looked like a prison. Caleb pulled the wagon to a halt and sat for a moment, his gaze fixed on the house. "This is it," he said, his voice quiet. He didn't look at her. He seemed to be giving her a moment to absorb it all. He got down his movements, economical and strong, and came around to her side. He offered a hand to help her down. She hesitated, her own hand hovering over his. His was large and calloused, a map of hard work. Reluctantly, she placed her hand in his. His grip was firm but gentle as he helped her to the ground. The brief contact sent a strange jolt through her, a current of awareness she wasn't prepared for. Inside the house was sparse, but immaculately clean. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room. A simple wooden table with 2 chairs stood in the center. The floors were swept, and the air smelled of pine and wood smoke. It was a house that was waiting for a life to be lived within it. But Isabella felt she had none left to give. Our room is this way. Caleb said, the slight stumble over the word our, betraying a discomfort that matched her own. He led her to a bedroom at the back of the house. It contained a solid oak bed frame, a washstand, with a pitcher and bowl, and a large wooden wardrobe. A beautiful, hand-stitched quilt lay folded at the foot of the bed, its colors a vibrant shock in the otherwise muted room. "My mother made that," he said, nodding toward the quilt. Before she passed, Isabella said nothing, running her fingers over the intricate stitching. It felt like an artifact from a different world, one filled with love and family things she now felt were lost to her forever. The silence of the wedding night stretched between them, thick and heavy. Caleb seemed to understand her fear. He didn't approach the bed instead, leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed. "You can have the bed," he said bluntly. "I'll take the floor here or the chair by the fire, whatever makes you comfortable." Isabella finally looked at him, truly looked at him. He seemed tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than she'd noticed before. "Why did you agree to this, Mr. Hayes?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why marry a woman who so clearly did not want you?" Caleb pushed himself off the doorframe and walked to the room's single window, staring out at the encroaching twilight. "Cain holds the note on this land," he said, his voice low and laced with a bitterness she recognized. "My father took out a loan years ago before he died. I've been working to pay it off, but a bad winter a few years back set me behind. Cain, he made me an offer. Marry you, and he tears up the note. This land, this house, it was my father's. It's all I have of him. I wasn't going to lose it." His confession hung in the air, a truth as plain and painful as her own. He was a prisoner, too. A different cage, perhaps, but a cage all the same. They were 2 pawns in Silas Cain's game, moved across the board to secure his victory. "So you sacrificed your life for a piece of dirt." The words were sharper than she intended. He turned from the window, and for the first time, a flicker of something hard and defensive entered his eyes. "This piece of dirt is my life, Mrs. Hayes," he said, the formal address a stark reminder of their new reality. "It's the only thing that's ever been mine. I imagine you did the same for your family. We all make sacrifices. Doesn't mean we have to like them." He was right. Her anger deflated, replaced by a wave of weary empathy. They were not enemies. They were victims of the same man. "I have no right to be your husband," Caleb continued, his voice softening again. "Not like this. So I won't be. Not until you look at me without seeing him." He didn't have to say Cain's name. "You'll be safe here. You have my word. That's all I can give you right now." He turned and left the room, closing the door softly behind him. Isabella stood alone in the quiet dark, the weight of his words settling over her. He had offered her safety, a small island in the storm of her life. He hadn't demanded anything of her, hadn't tried to claim the rights he was technically owed. He had seen her pain, and instead of ignoring it, had acknowledged it, and stepped back. She walked over to the bed and sank onto the mattress, pulling the colorful quilt up around her shoulders. It was warm and heavy. For the first time since Liam had disappeared, a single tiny fragile seed of something other than despair took root in her heart. It wasn't hope. It wasn't happiness. It was a sliver of grudging respect for the stranger in the other room. And in the crushing darkness of her new life, it was the only light she had. The days that followed bled into one another, measured not by a clock but by the sun's journey across the vast Montana sky. Life on the Hayes homestead was governed by a silent, unspoken rhythm. Caleb rose before dawn, the soft thud of his boots on the floorboards the only alarm Isabella needed. He would be gone for hours tending to his small herd of cattle, mending fences, and wresting a living from the unforgiving land. Isabella would wake later, the house empty and quiet, and find a pot of coffee kept warm on the stove and fresh water drawn from the well. Their interactions were minimal orbits that occasionally intersected, but never truly met. They ate their meals in near silence at the small wooden table. Caleb was not an unkind man. He was simply a quiet one. He would ask if she needed anything from town, if she was warm enough at night, if the food was to her liking. His questions were practical, devoid of emotion, and Isabella's answers were equally clipped. No, thank you. Yes. It's fine. She spent her days exploring the confines of her new world. She did not venture far from the house, but she learned the sound of the wind, sighing through the tall pines behind the barn, the chatter of the creek, the sharp cry of a hawk circling overhead. She took over the cooking and cleaning, not because it was expected, but because it gave her hands something to do, a way to mark the passage of time. She found a small garden plot Caleb's mother had once tended, and she began with a fierce, desperate energy to pull weeds and turn the soil her grief and anger poured into the earth. One afternoon, a week into their strange marriage, an old, grizzled man with a kindly, wrinkled face rode up to the house. He introduced himself as Samuel Caleb's only hired hand, who lived in a small cabin a mile down the creek. "Heard Caleb finally went and did it," Samuel said, his eyes twinkling as he accepted a glass of water from Isabella. "He's a good man, Ma'am. Quiet as a shadow, but solid as the mountains. Watched him grow up. His heart's in the right place, even if he don't always know the right words to say it." Isabella merely nodded, unsure how to respond. Samuel seemed to read the sadness in her eyes. "This ain't easy country for a woman," he said gently. "Can be lonely, but it's honest country. It don't lie to you, and neither does Caleb." His words stuck with her long after he had ridden away. Honest country. It don't lie to you, but men did. Silas Kane had lied. And what about Liam? She clung to the image of him, the pure, untarnished memory of his love. He was her saint, her martyr, the symbol of the life that had been stolen from her. The thought that he would return for her was the one ember she kept glowing in the cold hearth of her heart. A few days later, the shadow of their benefactor fell upon the homestead. Two of Kane's men, brutish thugs named Frank and Donnie, rode into the yard. Isabella was hanging laundry on the line when they arrived, and she froze her heart, pounding against her ribs. "Afternoon, Mrs. Hayes." Frank sneered, his gaze roaming over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Mr. Kane just wanted us to stop by, see how the happy couple is settling in. Make sure everything is agreeable." The threat was clear, veiled in false concern. Before Isabella could respond, Caleb appeared from the barn, holding a heavy wrench in his hand. He moved with a quiet, deliberate menace that was more intimidating than any loud posturing. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't run. He simply walked to stand between Isabella and the two men. "Everything's fine," Caleb said, his voice flat and cold. "You can tell Mr. Kane we don't need any visitors." "Just being neighborly." Donnie chuckled, but his eyes were fixed on the wrench in Caleb's hand. "This is my property," Caleb said, his blue eyes turning to chips of ice. "My wife. You've delivered your message. Now ride out." The two men exchanged a look. They were bigger than Caleb, and there were two of them. But there was something in Caleb's stance, a coiled stillness that promised swift and terrible violence that gave them pause. After a long, tense moment, Frank shrugged. "Whatever you say, Hayes." He tipped his hat mockingly at Isabella. "Mum." They turned their horses and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and tension in their wake. Isabella's hands were shaking so hard she'd dropped a clothespin. Caleb turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Did they touch you?" "No," she whispered. He nodded, once his jaw tight. He walked over to the fence post and slammed the heavy wrench down on it, the sharp crack of metal on wood echoing the violence he had held in check. He didn't say another word. He just turned and walked back into the barn, leaving her alone with the flapping laundry and the sudden stark realization that this quiet, solitary man had just declared his home, and her as territory Silas Kane was not welcome to cross. That night, for the first time, she didn't just cook dinner. She found a jar of peaches she had helped her mother preserve last summer and served them for dessert. When Caleb came in from his evening chores, he stopped and looked at the small bowl by his plate. "Thank you," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. They ate in their usual silence, but it felt different. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but the quiet of two people who had faced a common enemy and stood their ground. As she lay in bed that night, listening to the sound of Caleb settling into his chair by the dying fire in the other room, she thought of his promise at the altar. "I'll make you smile someday." It still seemed an impossible, ridiculous notion, but for the first time, she didn't resent him for saying it. The image of Liam O'Connell was a holy relic Isabella kept polished in her mind. His easy laugh, the way a stray lock of dark hair fell across his forehead, the feel of his hand in hers as they walked through her father's vineyard, dreaming of a future. He had promised to send for her. He had promised to come back. Every dust cloud on the horizon, every lone rider sparked a frantic, foolish hope in her chest that it might be him. Caleb saw it. He saw the way her eyes would dart toward the road, the way she would fall silent, lost in a world he couldn't enter. He saw the grief that was a constant living presence in their house, and he saw the danger in it. Hope he knew could be a poison when it was pinned to a lie. Silas Kane was not a man who left loose ends. If Liam O'Connell was alive, Kane would know where he was. If he was dead, Kane would know where he was buried. Caleb was a patient man, but he was not a passive one. He could not build a life, not even the pretense of one, on a foundation haunted by a ghost. He needed the truth for her sake, as much as his own. One Tuesday he told Isabella he was riding into Benton, a larger town, a day's ride away for supplies that couldn't be found in Redemption Creek. It was a plausible reason, and she accepted it without question. But his true destination was the office of the former sheriff of Redemption Creek, a man named Brody, who had retired to Benton after disagreeing with the way Silas Kane ran things. He found Sheriff Brody nursing a whiskey in a quiet saloon. Brody was a man whose face looked like a crumpled map, but his eyes were still sharp. "Caleb Hayes." Brody grunted, surprised. "What brings you all the way out here? Trouble with your new father-in-law?" He used the term mockingly. "I need to know what really happened to Liam O'Connell," Caleb said, getting straight to the point. Brody sighed and took a long drink. "What you've been told, I expect. Accused of rustling, Kane's cattle ran off before he could be brought to justice." "I don't believe it," Caleb stated. "Belief doesn't change the facts on the warrant," Brody said wearily. "The warrant I was forced to sign before I quit." He looked Caleb up and down. "You married the Rossi girl. This isn't about justice, is it? It's about her." Caleb didn't answer. He just waited. Brody swirled the whiskey in his glass. "It was too clean, Hayes. Too perfect. Kane had a witness, one of his own men, who swore he saw O'Connell driving a dozen head of Kane's cattle toward the pass. But the tracks, they were shoddy, deliberate, and O'Connell just vanished. No one vanishes that completely unless they have help, or they're put in the ground. "Is there any way to know for sure?" Caleb pressed. Brody grunted. "Kane is meticulous. He keeps records of everything. Payments, debts, shipments. He has a ledger, a private one. Keeps it in a safe in his office at the ranch. If there was a payoff, if there was a bribe, it'd be in there. But getting to it, that's a suicide mission." Caleb thanked him and left his mind racing. A ledger, a payoff. The idea struck a discordant note. Kane wasn't the type to pay a man to leave. He was the type to use a bullet. It was cheaper and more permanent. The story didn't sit right. His business in Benton wasn't finished. There was one other person he needed to see, the clerk at the telegraph office. Caleb remembered Samuel mentioning that Liam had a cousin who worked the gold fields up north near Helena. It was a long shot. Posing as a friend of the family, Caleb paid the clerk, a young man named Thomas, a silver dollar to look through the past few months of outgoing messages. "Looking for a wire from Liam O'Connell to his cousin Patrick," Caleb explained. "Sent around 2, maybe 3 months ago. The family is worried." The clerk, eager for the coin, began flipping through his books. After 20 minutes, he found it. "Here it is, sent 2 days after he supposedly ran from the law." Thomas handed the book to Caleb. The message was brief, its words like a punch to the gut. "Patrick, Kane paid $500, more than I'd make in 10 years, heading west to California, the girl not worth dying for. Don't write to Redemption Creek. Liam." Caleb read it once, then twice. He felt the air leave his lungs. $500, the girl not worth dying for. Silas Kane hadn't framed an innocent man. He had found a guilty one. He hadn't run Liam off. He had bought him. He had identified the weakness in his opponent's champion, the flaw in Isabella's saint. Liam O'Connell hadn't been a martyr. He was a coward who had sold his love and her future for a bag of gold. Kane hadn't needed to kill him. He had simply named his price. It was a far crueler, more brilliant victory. The ride home was the longest of Caleb's life. The telegram book's entry was burned into his mind. He carried a truth that would shatter the last beautiful thing Isabella had to hold on to. He could lie. He could say he found nothing and let her keep her ghost. But what then? Let her spend the rest of her life waiting for a man who had sold her out and would never return. A man who had deemed her not worth the fight. He knew what he had to do. It would be the cruelest thing he had ever done. It might also be the kindest. He arrived back at the homestead late the next night. Isabella had left a lamp burning in the window and a plate of food warming by the fire. Her simple, unspoken gesture of concern made what he was about to do even harder. She met him at the door, her eyes full of a question she didn't dare ask. "Did you find the supplies you needed, Isabella?" He said, his voice heavy. "We need to talk." He told her everything. He told her about Brody, about the telegraph office, about the message. He didn't soften the words. He didn't try to cushion the blow. He gave her the truth, raw and unvarnished, just as he had received it. The girl not worth dying for. She listened without speaking, her face growing paler with every word. When he finished, she didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply stood there, the last light of her hope extinguished, leaving behind an unnerving, absolute emptiness. The saint she had built in her mind had crumbled to dust, revealing a weak and greedy man beneath. Her great love story wasn't a tragedy. It was a cheap transaction. "I see," she said, her voice a hollow echo of itself. She turned and walked to their room, her room, and closed the door. Caleb stood alone in the main room, the weight of her shattered heart pressing down on him. He had made her a promise at the altar, a vow to make her smile. But tonight, he had only given her a new and more terrible reason to cry. For 3 days, Isabella was a ghost in her own home. She moved through the motions of her chores with a chilling, mechanical precision. She cooked, she cleaned, she tended the garden, but her eyes were vacant, her spirit absent. The vibrant, passionate grief for a lost love had been replaced by the flat grey ash of betrayal. Caleb had not just taken away her hope, he had invalidated her past, recasting her great romance as a fool's delusion. Caleb gave her space, his heart aching with every silent meal, every averted gaze. He had known the truth would hurt, but he hadn't anticipated this utter devastation. He had ripped out the foundations of her world, and now she was drifting untethered. On the evening of the 3rd day, she did not serve dinner. Caleb came in from the barn to find her sitting at the table, not with food, but with his rifle, which she had taken down from its pegs over the mantelpiece. It was lying on the table before her, and she was calmly, methodically cleaning it, her movements sure and practiced from a childhood spent on a remote vineyard, where knowing how to handle a firearm was a necessity. Caleb stopped in the doorway, his heart lurching. She didn't look up. "My father taught me to shoot when I was 12. She said, her voice quiet, but clear, stripped of its former fragility. He said a woman in this country needs to know how to protect what's hers. She finally raised her eyes to meet his. The emptiness was gone. In its place was a hard, cold fire. Liam was never mine, my family's land, my future, that was. And Silas Kane tried to steal it. She pushed a clean, oiled rag through the barrel of the rifle. I've spent months crying for a ghost, a weak, worthless man who sold me for $500. I will not waste another tear on him. She looked directly at Caleb, her gaze intense and unwavering. But I will not let Cain win. He built his kingdom on the backs of men like my father and yours. He used my heart as a weapon against my own family. I want to see him ruined. A profound shift had occurred. The grieving girl was gone, and in her place was a woman forged in the crucible of betrayal. Her focus had narrowed from a lost love to a present enemy. Caleb felt a surge of something he could only describe as fierce admiration. He pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down. Ruining Silas Kane is a tall order, Isabella. He owns the sheriff, the bank. He owns this town. He doesn't own us, she countered. Not anymore. You said Sheriff Brody told you about a ledger, a private one where Kane keeps his real records. If we could get that ledger, we would have proof of every crooked deal he's ever made. Proof of the real debt my father owed, not the inflated lie he used against him. Proof of what he holds over you. Proof of everything. It was a dangerous, reckless idea. It was, as Brody had said, a suicide mission. But as Caleb looked at the woman across from him, at the burning resolve in her eyes, he knew he couldn't dissuade her. More than that, he didn't want to. For the first time, they were not a reluctant husband and a grieving bride. They were partners, allies. His office is at his main ranch, Caleb said, his mind already turning over the logistics. It's guarded day and night. But not every minute, Isabella said, leaning forward. Next month is the town's founding day celebration. There's a big barn dance at the Miller property on the other side of the valley. Kane will be there. He has to be playing the part of the town's benevolent patriarch. He'll take most of his men with him for show. Caleb watched her, amazed at the strategic mind that was emerging from behind the veil of sorrow. He'll still leave guards. 2, maybe 3, she acknowledged. But they'll be relaxed, thinking about the whiskey and the women at the dance. They won't be expecting a quiet rancher and his wife to come calling. For the next few weeks, an entirely new rhythm established itself on the homestead. During the day, they performed their usual chores, presenting a facade of normalcy to the world. But at night, after the sun had bled below the horizon, their real work began. Caleb drew a map of Kane's ranch from memory marking patrol routes and sightlines. Isabella, who had a finer hand and a keen eye for detail, refined it, asking questions he hadn't thought to consider. Where were the dogs kept? Which windows had the best view of the approach? Which floorboards in the main house creaked? Caleb taught her how to handle his Colt revolver, how to load it quickly, how to stand and aim. She was a natural, her hands, steady her focus, absolute. In turn, she taught him things he never knew. Having delivered baked goods to the Kane ranch with her mother in years past, she knew the layout of the house's ground floor. She knew the cook was hard of hearing, and that the pantry window had a faulty latch. They worked together, their quiet conversations filled with plans and contingencies. The silence between them was no longer awkward or heavy with unspoken grief. It was a comfortable silence, born of shared purpose and a growing mutual respect. He began to see past the tragic bride and saw the sharp, resilient woman she was. She began to see past the stoic stranger and saw the clever, steadfast man who had quietly stood by her side. One evening, as they were poring over the map by lamplight, her hand brushed his as they both reached for the pencil. A spark of warmth passed between them, and she didn't pull away. She looked up, and her eyes held a new light, something other than anger or sorrow. It was a flicker of awareness, of a connection being forged in the fires of their shared mission. Caleb felt his breath catch. He had promised to make her smile, but in plotting the downfall of their enemy, he was inadvertently helping her find something far more valuable, her strength. And he realized with a startling clarity that his reasons for wanting to destroy Silas Kane were no longer just about his land. They were about her. The night of the Redemption Creek Founding Day celebration arrived on a cool, clear breeze, carrying the distant sound of fiddle music from the Miller barn across the valley. The moon was a slender sliver, offering little light for which Caleb and Isabella were grateful. Dressed in dark clothing, they rode not on the main road, but through the winding, shadowed cattle trails that Caleb knew like the back of his hand. They tethered their horses in a dense copse of aspen trees, a half-mile from the sprawling Kane Ranch house. The main building, a dark silhouette against the star-dusted sky. Lights burned in the bunkhouse and in a few windows of the main house, but just as Isabella had predicted, the place was unnervingly quiet. The majority of Kane's men were enjoying their boss's feigned generosity at the town dance. 2 guards, Caleb whispered, pointing from the cover of the trees. One on the porch, one making a slow round of the property. The one making the rounds is Donnie, Isabella breathed, recognizing the man's hulking shape. He'll stop at the bunkhouse for a drink from his flask every 15 minutes. We'll have a window then. They waited, their hearts pounding in a shared, silent rhythm. They watched Donnie complete one full circuit and, sure enough, slip into the bunkhouse. The guard on the porch, a man they didn't recognize, settled into a chair, his head lolling back. Now, Caleb said. They moved like shadows skirting the edge of the yard, using the deep darkness cast by the outbuildings for cover. They reached the back of the house, their destination, the pantry window Isabella remembered. As she had said, the latch was loose. With a faint squeak, Caleb pushed it open and slipped inside, then reached back to help her through. They were in, The house smelled of cigar smoke leather and whiskey, the smell of Silas Kane himself. Moving on silent feet, they navigated the darkened kitchen and entered the main hall. The grandfather clock against the far wall ticked with an unnerving loudness, each second stretching into an eternity. Kane's office was at the end of the hall. The door was unlocked. The office was a shrine to the man's ego. A massive oak desk dominated the room, and the walls were adorned with the mounted heads of elk and a grizzly bear, their glass eyes seeming to watch their every move. Behind the desk was a large, imposing portrait of Kane. "The safe will be behind the painting," Isabella whispered, her voice barely audible. Caleb carefully lifted the heavy frame from the wall, revealing the black iron door of a formidable safe, its brass dial gleaming in the sliver of moonlight from the window. "Did you ever see him open it?" Caleb asked. "Once," she breathed. "He was showing off for my father years ago. I remember he made a joke about his birth year. 'The year I was born to rule this valley,' he said. "When was he born?" "He's 56 now," Isabella recalled. "This is 88, so 1832. Caleb knelt before the safe, his calloused fingers carefully turning the dial. The soft clicks were like cannon shots in the silence. He tried the combination, right to 18, left to 32. Nothing. He tried it again, reversing the direction. Still nothing. "Think, Isabella!" He urged, his voice tight with tension. "Did he say anything else?" She closed her eyes, trying to transport herself back to that moment. "He laughed. He said something about the numbers being as plain as the nose on your face." "Plain." Her eyes shot open. "The painting. It's not just a portrait. It's a land deed. Look at the bottom." Caleb squinted at the painting, which he had leaned against the desk. At the very bottom, in small gold-leaf script, was the artist's signature, and the date it was completed, J. Peterson, 1881. "It's a long shot," he muttered, turning back to the safe. He spun the dial, right to 18, left to 81. He pulled the handle. With a heavy, satisfying clunk, the safe door swung open. Inside were stacks of money deeds, and sitting right on top, a thick, leather-bound book, the ledger. Caleb grabbed it, his hands trembling slightly. They had it. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked in the hallway outside the office. They froze, their eyes locking in shared panic. Footsteps were approaching, slow and heavy. Caleb shoved the ledger into Isabella's hands. "The window," he mouthed, drawing his Colt. Isabella didn't hesitate. She darted to the office window as Caleb flattened himself against the wall beside the door. She fumbled with the latch, her fingers clumsy with fear. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. The doorknob began to turn. Just as the door creaked open, Isabella managed to heave the window up. She scrambled out, dropping into the flower bed below, just as a voice boomed from the office. "Who's in here?" It was Frank, the other thug from the yard. He must have come from the bunkhouse. Isabella didn't wait to see what would happen. Clutching the ledger to her chest, she ran her lungs, burning her only thought, to draw the guards away from the house, away from Caleb. A shot rang out, splintering the night air. Then another. She heard shouting men running from the bunkhouse. She risked a glance over her shoulder. Silhouetted in the now-lit office window, she saw Caleb trading shots with Frank. "Go!" Caleb's voice roared across the yard, a desperate, commanding shout. "Get it to Brody! Go!" Tears of terror and desperation streamed down her face, but she didn't stop. She ran harder, faster than she had ever run in her life, clutching the proof of Silas Kane's corruption. She plunged into the darkness of the trees where the horses were hidden, her heart breaking with every step that took her further away from Caleb, who had stayed behind to buy her time. He was facing down Kane's men alone to ensure their mission succeeded. The ride to Benton was a frantic, desperate blur. Isabella pushed her horse harder than she ever had, the wind whipping tears from her eyes, tears not of sorrow, but of sheer terror for Caleb. The heavy ledger tucked into a saddlebag felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, a testament to the sacrifice being made for it. Every rustle of leaves, every coyote's howl sounded like hoofbeats in pursuit. She reached Benton just as the first pale light of dawn was breaking her horse, lathered and stumbling with exhaustion. She found Sheriff Brody's small house and pounded on the door, not stopping until the old lawman opened it, a pistol in his hand, and sleep still in his eyes. "Mrs. Hayes," he asked, his eyes widening at her disheveled state. "What in God's name? The ledger?" She gasped, pushing the heavy book into his hands. "It's Kane's. It has everything. But Caleb, he stayed behind. He's still at the ranch. They know." Brody's demeanor shifted instantly from sleepy retiree to seasoned lawman. He flipped through the ledger, his eyes scanning the neat columns of names, dates, and figures. A low whistle escaped his lips. "Good Lord, girl, this is it. This is everything. Extortion, fraudulent loans, bribery. He even logged the $500 he paid to O'Connell." He looked up at her, his expression grim but resolute. "You did the hard part. Now it's my turn." Brody wasn't the town sheriff anymore, but he still held sway. He went straight to the territorial marshal, a man who had long suspected Kane, but never had the concrete proof to move against him. The ledger was more than proof. It was a confession written in Kane's own hand. Within hours, a posse of marshals was riding hard for Redemption Creek. Isabella, refusing to be left behind, rode with them, her exhaustion, forgotten her entire being, focused on one single hope, that they wouldn't be too late. They arrived at the Kane Ranch to a scene of controlled chaos. Silas Kane himself was on the porch, directing his men, his face a mask of fury. When he saw the marshals led by Brody and a determined-looking Isabella, his face paled. "What is the meaning of this, Marshal?" Kane blustered. "Silas Kane, you're under arrest," the lead marshal announced, holding up the ledger. "For fraud, extortion, and a list of other crimes long enough to pave a road to Helena. We have your book." Kane's eyes darted from the ledger to Isabella, and the look he gave her was one of pure, venomous hatred. His empire had been toppled by the one person he had considered a pawn. "Where is my husband?" Isabella demanded, her voice ringing out clear and strong. One of Kane's men, under the stony glare of a marshal, pointed a shaky finger toward the barn. "He's in there. He put up a hell of a fight." Isabella ran her boots sinking into the dusty yard. The barn door was riddled with bullet holes. She pushed it open, her heart in her throat. Caleb was slumped against a hay bale in the corner, his face pale and beaded with sweat. His left arm was bound with a torn piece of his own shirt, stained dark with blood, and a nasty gash was bleeding sluggishly on his forehead. But he was alive. And when he saw her, a look of profound, bone-deep relief washed over his face. "Isabella," he breathed, "you made it." She rushed to his side, dropping to her knees, her hands hovering over his wounds, afraid to touch him. "You fool!" she whispered, a sob catching in her throat. "You magnificent, stubborn fool! You could have been killed." "The ledger is safe?" he asked, his voice strained. "Yes. It's over, Caleb. Brody and the marshals have Kane. It's over." He closed his eyes for a moment, the tension finally leaving his body. He had held off 4 of Kane's men, using the barn for cover, until they had finally overpowered him just before the posse arrived. He had bought her more than enough time. He opened his eyes again and looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the dust on her face, the fierce light in her eyes, the strength she had discovered within herself. She was no longer the weeping bride he had married. She was a warrior. "My father's debt is cleared," she said softly. "Your land is yours, free and clear." We did it. Caleb reached up with his good hand, his fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair from her cheek. His touch was warm, hesitant, and it sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with fear. It was the first time he had touched her with simple, unadorned tenderness. She looked at this man who had married her to save his home, who had protected her from thugs, who had uncovered a painful truth to set her free, and who had nearly died to help her win back her family's future. He had been her warden, her protector, her partner, and now he was something more. A feeling swelled in her chest, warm and unfamiliar, and wonderfully bright. It was gratitude, it was admiration, it was a deep and profound affection that had grown in the soil of their shared hardship. And as she looked at him, battered and bleeding but alive and safe, a genuine, unforced, radiant smile spread across her face. It reached her eyes, crinkling the corners, and lit her up from the inside. Caleb stared at her, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. He had seen her cry, seen her rage, seen her determined, but he had never seen this. It was more beautiful than any sunrise he'd ever witnessed over his mountains. A slow, tired grin touched his own lips. "Well, I'll be," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I guess I kept my promise." And so, in the dust and aftermath of a tyrant's fall, a quiet cowboy finally fulfilled the vow he'd whispered at the altar. Caleb Hayes didn't just give Isabella Rossi a reason to smile. He gave her the freedom to find her own strength, and in doing so they found a love far more real and resilient than any youthful fantasy. Their story wasn't born of courtship and stolen glances, but forged in shared danger and mutual respect, a testament to the fact that sometimes the most profound love stories don't start with a kiss, but with a promise to weather the storm together. What do you think does a love born from hardship burn brighter than one born from ease? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were captivated by the story of Isabella and Caleb, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with a friend who loves a good Western drama, and don't forget to subscribe for more tales from the wild, untamed heart of the Old West.